I wanted to start by thanking all of you for attending. My name is Sheahan Stephan, and I've been in the gemstone industry for coming up on 14 years this July. And I really started out with nothing, literally. I was buying $5 a carat stones and trying to make a profit on that, traveling around the world. But that's what really fine-tuned my senses and my ability to identify gemstones and, trying to make it through the industry. And along the way, I realized that improving my sense of sight or touch or smell or taste or whatever it is that I'm using to evaluate, I picked up an expertise. I've put probably close to 30,000 hours in the industry over that 14 years. So this is essentially partly my story. It's also my expertise. And this is what I've kind of brought to a delta. The presentation today is trend versus passion. So I'm making a comparison between the stones that we're passionate about, blue sapphires and Padparadschas, for obvious reasons over thousands of years. And then we have a trend that's come in, which is the teal and peach. So I actually would prefer that you ask me questions as we move through the slides, because sometimes it can be just difficult to go back to a subject or subject matter from the very beginning. We're looking at 45 slides. I'll get through them in probably 35 to 40 minutes if there are no questions. Otherwise, we can go the full hour. So like I said, we're going to be comparing blue sapphires and Padparadschas with peach and teal. What's kind of driving the industry? So question number one, what's driving the teal color sapphire market? And then when did this trend begin? That's another question I'd like to answer. How long will it last? I think that's important to everyone here who's a retailer, because you don't want to jump ship early, but you don't want to also be too late, because otherwise you can be stuck with stones that you might not necessarily have much use for. Pricing volatility with a off color, peach and teal. They're trade terms, and I think they're trade terms for a reason, because they're non-traditional. Understanding the GIA color wheel, I think most of you in here to some level would have seen that. And then understanding the pricing and also understanding how the origin of these stones impact us or impact the price. So we're going to start with teal color sapphire. And so teal is going to start in this range right here, greenish blue, down to bluish green. So if any of you have seen or looked at teal sapphires, you can see the variety. The one thing that I would also like to point out is teal sapphires react very poorly to light. So especially direct light. Deflected light, it's actually very nice. And also incandescent light, it can be better. But if you've viewed any teal sapphires over the course of the last few days here at this show, most of you can see that daylight, it doesn't react very well to daylight lamps. It actually washes them out. However, outside, the reaction is much better to sunlight. But the daylight lamps, this has been my observation, that they're washed out. So the first thing we should all understand is this color, non-traditional, is consumer driven. So usually in a traditional sense, when we look at sapphires, rubies, emeralds, it's supply and demand. So how much is coming out of the ground versus, the consumer's interest in it. But this is the actual, with teal and peach specifically, so I'll keep going back to that. It's consumer driven. So even when we look at the pricing structure, and we'll get to a graph towards the end of this set on teal, you can see that there's a lot of volatility because the consumer is dictating, essentially based on their demand, what the pricing is going to be. And year over year, the back end will make those adjustments, not year over year. I mean, the graph is going to be year over year but the pricing is actually almost instantaneous, especially in back-end source countries. So we could be looking at today paying $350 per carat for a 6.5 millimeter round, and because of the volatility of the color and the back-end understanding, back-end meaning mining and production countries understanding that there's a demand, they just naturally just keep raising the price till it flattens out. Everyone kind of understands that? Yeah. Okay. So moving on. Who's buying this? Non-traditional bridal. It fits a different market sector. Millennial generations. The millennial generation really is interested in non-traditional. So one thing that I've found that millennials are into is non-quantifiable niche market products. They're also more budget conscious. You know, they could probably buy a 1.5 carat round for $2,500. You know, for something similar in a diamond, you know, starting at least double, going up to like 4 times that, depending on the various factors. They're heavily into value, so, and they educate themselves very much. So understanding that value equals quality times price, standard business school formula. So with teal, I'm actually grouping 3 varieties. There's going to be the blue-green, classified as teal. Then there's going to be the bicolor, green-yellow, and then where there's distinctive areas of one color. So in a bicolor stone such as this, the yellowish green in the middle and more saturated green on the sides. That's one market, or that's one stone that the group that we're speaking about is interested in. And the other color is teal and yellowish green or greenish yellow. So from where I stand and when I started producing, running a production of this color, we're going back about 5 to 6 years. And at that time, we were primarily dealing in this size range, 0.5 carat to 1.5 carats. The primary origin of this color is going to be Madagascar. I would say Madagascar is the biggest producer. Then and they hit very nice, nearly loop clean quality, and I mean it goes all the way to heavily included. But out of all the source countries, Madagascar seems to be producing the nicest quality. Sri Lanka tends to be more earthy tone, as far as a yellowish green to greenish brown sometimes. And then obviously we have Montana, and that's become very popular over the last especially like 4 to 5 years. And it goes both ways. I think that the Madagascar material drives the Montana, and the Montana drives the Madagascar. Please.
Stones that I've seen in the past and items in my collection, anything that's off blue seems to be created by a color zoning between blue and yellow layers. Is that always the case?
You know what? So this could be also origin specific. So I tend to see more color zoning where it's primarily one color in one area, and then another so it could be greenish blue in one area, and then more yellowish green in another. And I'm seeing more of that coming out of Australia, and that could be also the most of the Australian sapphire is at a metamorphic level. So that's starting almost 8 kilometers deep, versus Sri Lanka. I mean, there's this whole Pangea theory, right? So this point at which all these continents were connected. So it would make sense that Madagascar and Sri Lanka were at one point or another were connected. So producing similar colors is really feasible. But seeing a drastic difference, for example, between Madagascar and Australia also makes sense because of the depth And that means depth also means temperature. And temperature is also changing color, if that all makes sense. Higher iron content with the Australian material. So we just basically touched on this. So color description by origin, I would definitely say that the Sri Lankan material is more earthy tone, so sometimes a brownish component. And then Madagascar tends to have a more pure teal. Pure teal. Nice saturation, good hue, and I think overall it's a more pure color. And then there tends to be a more darkish tone coming from Australia. Like I just said, higher iron content goes hand in hand with the color. And so this is an example of what I'm calling time versus volume, and then time versus price. So if we look at 2014, price per carat for roughly an average weight of 1.4, round oval or cushion, started out at 185 a carat. And 2019, 390. That's a substantial price change. For, I would say, if I saw, I wouldn't have purchased it, but if I saw this material in 2008, it was probably right around 50 to 60 bucks a carat. Yeah, so that's, I think this is a pretty substantial price shift, but as long as the demand is there, the supply the supply is there, but they're going to control the pricing in the back end. That's what happened with a lot of the other colors, you know. And a lot of times, you know, we're dealing in developing countries, so they're always, you know, wanting more. They're consistently not happy. So moving on, my predictions of teal specifically is going to be very cyclical, up and down. I'm happy to, like, for me, teal was an important color because I hit it at the right time. It was on its up cycle. But just over the last few years, I've seen it go up and down, up and down. So that's something to be cautious about when you're making those purchases. But I also believe the color is going to be in demand on the front end for at least 2 to 3 years. I'd say at least 2 at a high level. And then, you know, we keep reevaluating that. Even at my end, I have to reevaluate, like, how much rough am I going to continue to purchase in that color. You know, then we look at the style and the fashion. I mean, essentially, we're in the fashion industry. And if you look at, you know, clothing styles, they go in and out. You know, basically any style will come in and then it'll go out for 20 or 30 years and then it'll come in with slight modifications. So I believe that will also be the case with this color. Yeah. So the primary shapes that I'm also seeing are going to be round, oval, and emerald cut. Any questions? No. So moving on to blue, current supply and demand, contrary to teal's demand and supply. It's the exact opposite that it works. Are any of you familiar with the term Gyoda? Yeah, so one person. I'll give you the 2-minute version. There's 7 types, right? And so sapphire is aluminum oxide. That's the base. And then trace elements, titanium and iron, will give it its color. So Gyoda is the whitish variety. Roughly 70% of all blue sapphires that are heated in the market are of the Gyoda variety. They come out of the ground white. And once they're heated, they turn blue. It's a chemical reaction. And Gyoda is broken down into 7 varieties based on their internal inclusions. When these inclusions are heated, and this is also one of my expertises in heat treatment of sapphire, we partition them into groups, and then we have to determine which variety it is and what temperature we have to cycle it up to. So the first stage of heat treatment, if we want to reduce color, we use a blowpipe method where they actually blow heat it with charcoal and a pipe. Very old, primitive method, been around for thousands of years. The more modern method is with a gas furnace. The furnace will hit up to 2000 centigrade, but basically right around anywhere between 1550 centigrade and 1950 centigrade, there will be a chemical reaction where the stones will actually turn blue. And so that's why it's important to subdivide the types of gyoda so we know which temperature point it needs to heat up to. And hopefully we get the right outcome. And this is, again, it's an industry based on experience and senses. So the person who runs my furnace, he's got 50 years of experience. So he's very good at identifying gyoda and determining the color. Yes.
Is this at atmospheric pressure, and what's the time frame by which you leave it between 1500 and 2000 centigrade?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, again, the atmosphere is reducing, and so it's a gas oxygen mixture, and so we basically when we increase the gas and we increase the oxygen, the temperature goes up. But we do have to evaluate the type of gyoda. So gyoda is a traditional back-end term. Anytime I use the term back-end, it means the mining areas, mining regions, production work, essentially heating, mining, cutting, distribution. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So next, I'll also discuss briefly primary origins, heating versus heated versus unheated, and its availability. Once we group all those heated stones together, it makes up 99% of all blue sapphires. Only 1% is unheated. So obviously there's a different value structure to unheated stones. Partly it's intrinsic to a slight level. And just like origin is intrinsic, Kashmir is a brand, Burma is a brand, Sri Lanka is a brand. So intrinsic always plays a part in this, and also understanding that traditionalists will be traditionalists and they raise the price as well. I'll hit on time versus price again for heated, and pricing trend for time versus price on unheated stones. So with blue sapphires, we're primarily in this range, blue to a violetish blue, or bluish violet. We don't really veer too far from that. So again, if you're looking at the color wheel, you go to the right, drastic price drop versus going to the left. So violetish blue is much more acceptable globally to a certain level than it would be even slight greenish blue in a blue sapphire realm. So if you're going to call it a blue sapphire, it's an immediate price drop if there's any green in it. It tends to be quite substantial. So moving on, this is what we would call, and I'm not a fan of trade terms because there's a lack of accuracy with using words, because then you have to define it and everyone's view of that word can be different. So this is considered an open royal blue, and open because of its of how bright it is. A traditional royal blue can be a little bit too dark sometimes. It's never going to hit opaque if it has any value. But open, essentially in the market, if they use the term open, it's very, very bright stone. Any questions? No? Good. So I'll go through the varieties of gyoda for you guys. So the most I rank them on my ability to evaluate it and my accuracy of getting the outcome color that I'm trying to achieve. Make sense? Yeah. So the easier I can evaluate it, the higher the price typically of the rough. So Dum is number 1. O2 is number 2. O2, Dum has an even bluish color. You put it in a furnace, the blue just gets better. U2 has a color concentration. These are the two easiest to remember because the color concentration, when it's heated, expands. Sometimes you can reverse it, and once it's cut and polished, you can, when you loop it, you'll see a color concentration. If you look at it backwards, you can identify the rough. Make sense? Good. Then there is silky variety, milky variety. Those are typically what you see in star sapphires. So when the prices started hitting these astronomical levels, 2012, 13, 14, there were so many people coming to Tucson, buying up all the stars and burning them out. Because, a 6 millimeter round, 12, 13 was hitting like $1,400 a carat. So they found better value in destroying a beautiful star sapphire because they're going to get more money for a fully transparent facet grade 6.5, 7 millimeter. So silky milky, and then there's thick silky, thick milky, and then there's another variety called diesel. This is actually a completely different topic that I lecture on, but that's the quick version. Primary origins. I think for an overall market reaching quality, Sri Lanka is probably number one because they cover the full gamut of heavily included up to like super fine. Some of the Sri Lankan material I'm seeing getting Burmese certs and also Kashmir certs. And I've seen this firsthand taking place. I mean, it's unethical, but that's where our ethics come in, and it's something that I'm a big opponent of is, don't sacrifice, your belief system just to make a quick $100,000. It's a lot of money, but at the same time, it's your reputation and ethics. So this is something that we're always kind of dealing with on the back end. And I just had that come across my desk. I bought a beautiful 5.65. I bought it cut and polished, and I looked at it and it looked Burmese. And it went to the lab, and we actually certed it as Sri Lankan, even though I knew it would get a Burma cert. So ethics plays an important part of our industry. I would say if I were to rank, Kashmir is mined out. So that's not it. Whatever's in the market is floating around right now. Burma has its own political issues. And so that's what sometimes it can drop the price. And I think in Burma's case, it's increasing the price because of scarcity. So that country internally, recently, it's been starting to develop more, but it's going to take, I think, a few decades before it reaches a higher production rate and they're able to go past just mining and start doing the treatment themselves, and then being able to produce higher facet grade material as well. Unheated material from any country, if it's beautiful, transparent, unheated material, I think that makes up about 1% or less. So with blue, current supply and demand, it's also the Pantone color of the year, which is probably going to increase its demand. So expect over the next couple of years, prices to jump at least a little bit. Blue is a very, very stable color. It went through until the Madagascar rush occurred in 2016. Sri Lanka, again, was the primary source, was one of the, as far as yield, there was over 5,000 mining licenses issued. And what they were controlling the market to a high level, especially post-Civil War. So from 2012 to about 2014, ridiculous prices. And we're going to see that in the graph when it comes up here in a minute. But again, now there will be a demand on the front end, which will also put us in a position where the back end is going to be vulnerable to increasing the prices some more. So just to cover the color here, this would be your typical cornflower blue. Going back a couple slides. This photographed a little bit lighter, but it's actually a no heat royal blue. And then This was the this guy was the open royal blue. So from a numerical grading point, the open royal blue would be considered color number 1. That cashmere silky royal blue, no heat royal blue, would also fall into the same numerical grading, 1.52 in that range. So when we're using trade terms, that can be a little bit challenging. This is cornflower, a cornflower blue, again very sought after color, and pastel. So if you're using like the GIA, numerical grading system, pastel would probably, this one right here would fall into probably a hue of VB, violetish blue, and a tone, probably looking at about a tone of 3 and a saturation of 3. Again, much more accurate. And again, pastel. Different surface use for photography. So going back to 2008, you can see here, heated price, unheated price. When we're looking at 2 to 3 carat average weight, $450 a carat, $850 a carat for unheated 3 carat stone. Right now, we're looking at in this range, top color, $4,500 per carat. So you can see that price shift taking place right here, major shift right here, very sharp increase right here, and it was starting right here. Can anyone tell me why that occurred? If you look at the graph, where's the price shift taking place, and why do you think that's occurring? Remember, we're dealing with developing countries. It was the end of a civil war. Just right around here, there was the end of a civil war. When I got into the industry in 2006, and by 2009, I had guys. At that point, I would say I was a dealer. I'd go over there, I'd buy it, bring it back. I had the guys that were supplying me just say, take it for a year. There's no way that can happen right now. No one is going to give you basically a 1-year memo of their product. With the prices of no heat sapphires are hitting like $4,500 for a 3 carat. So that's kind of a developing country issue. We can see how steep the graph is, even for heated material. But the nice thing with blue is it's one of the most important gemstones, and it will always go up in price. No volatility. Since I've been in business, the only time that I've been told it was volatile was in the early 80s, right around 82, 83. I was told that 3 carat or was heated 3 carat was hitting like $1,400-1,500 a carat. But I was 5, so I didn't know. Yeah. So moving on. My predictions: blue sapphire is the most popular colored stone in the United States. I don't think that's going to change. It has a steady trajectory in price. Will continue for the foreseeable future. I actually think it's a stable investment. You're going to get at least 10% return, which is better than a savings account, as long as you can identify it properly and get a report or something. Civil unrest, natural disasters will either lower or increase the price. And that's the only reason why I see there being any volatility with that color. Sri Lanka has been the largest producer of blue sapphires and has mined out only 3% of its land. So in the big picture, even with sustainability being so important, 3% over thousands of years is not a big number. Unheated blue sapphires in the 3 to 4 carat range, 3 to 4 carat, 3 to 4, then from 6 to 7 sizes, we'll see pricing increase of 20 to 25% year over year, specifically Burmese and Sri Lankan. It's a prediction. I built my business on intuition. Moving on. The peach colored sapphire. Any questions so far? No? Does it all make sense? Good. Peach. Something that we need to understand, the difference between a peach and a Padparadscha is the peach color is much more blended. Padparadscha can have distinctive areas of color. So peach, you can see it's going to go from a orangish yellow. Sometimes they'll call it peach, sometimes they call it champagne. But that's another reason why trade terms are not definitive. They're just a term, it's a name. I like to use using my sight, I like to identify whether it's going to be a Padparadscha without the use of a laboratory. I would say I have about a 90% accuracy, and I use something called the 20/80 scale. So it has to have at least a minimum of 20% of one color and 80% of the other to be called a Padparadscha. If it falls outside of that range, it's not. It's going to be a peach. If it has some level of distinctive color zoning, meaning pinkish and orangish, if it's above 20% to one side or if it's below 20% to one side and above 80% to the other, is going to be a peach. If it's closer to 50-50, it'll be a Padparadscha, especially if it has those color concentrations. What's driving the market? Again, very similar to the teal sapphire. It's the same consumer but different color. They essentially want. I see part of that market is looking for a Padparadscha and hopefully getting one by mistake. But they're primarily they like the color. And it's the same trend as the teal, but peach is less volatile than teal color. So going back here to the color range for peach, it can range anywhere from reddish orange down to yellowish orange. The only area that's not shown here is pinkish. So it's basically going to fall in this range right here. Peach, it's just the saturation is going to be pretty weak. So moving on. Orangish yellow, sometimes champagne, and this is also considered, if this was a Padparadscha, slightly more saturated, again, on the yellowish orange side, it's falling under 20%. But if it was above 20%, it would be considered the sunrise Padparadscha. So if you look at the sunrise on a clear day, it's going to be yellowish orange. As I already went over, the 80% of one color and 20% of the other. So you can see a little bit of pinkish right here, but it's just not enough color. This is this is also a sunrise color, but very, very light tone. A little bit pinkish. Are any of you familiar with the stability issues with this color? No? So peach, Padparadscha, yellow sapphire have had a major problem over the last 5 years. And that is at very specific temperature points, the color fades off. And this is what we have found it to be is right around 90 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I actually encountered this in one case with one stone that I had sold. And the customer called me up. And basically, because of the chain of custody that I follow, I was able to trace it back to the heater, the person who heated it, and then also the mine that it came out of. And it came from Madagascar. So that was one thing that we had to keep in mind is there was some issue with the peach Padparadscha yellowish orange colors that were coming from Madagascar that were unheated. So unstable color, unstable color, and how do we correct it? My expert on heat treatment is the person who runs my furnace. What does he tell me? When did the color change occur? And it went from an orangish yellow to nearly white. And the jeweler had actually only put her torch during setting up to the stone for, I think she said, less than 5 minutes, which shouldn't have been a problem. So Donapalo, who runs my furnace, it didn't make any sense to me, but he actually said, you need to place it under UV light for 12 hours. And his other answer was that once it's done with 12 hours, to put it in your mouth. And I guess between the UV light and the temperature, your body temperature, it brought the color back. So this is essentially what I told the person that had purchased it, and she tried it, and it worked. But you have to catch it immediately. If you don't run into the problem, one thing that I decided to is I run a redundant process. So, to be able to guarantee the customer that they're getting what they are asking for. So the fourth step with peach and Padparadscha is I send it off to be tested by AGL because they do something called a fade test. And it's temperature and lighting. And based on its stability, then we can determine whether it's going to fade off or not. Yes, please.
After the process to get the color back, what's the chance of stability? And how many percentage of paparazchas in the market are unheated?
How many percent? Yeah, I can tell you. It's just an estimate. But the stability issue, I think it's really important that we follow the correct steps to help guarantee your customer with peach sapphires. So, for example, just to clarify on stability, even though there's probably with peach on, let's say, on a 3 to 4 carat size range, or let's say 2 to 3 carat, you're looking at wholesale right around $550 to $750 per carat. I have to tack on about $150 for certification, insurance, shipping, and now a fade test to do that. So I would say unless the supplier can guarantee you it's not going to fade off, expect to be given a certificate that guarantees it won't fade. What was the other question?
I wanted to know that you said the color came back after that process you suggested.
Yeah.
Will it be stable again?
It probably not. Probably not. Yeah. Yeah. So, are the problems origin related? Yes. I would say that I'm hearing 90% of the issues are coming from Madagascar. So, like every single Madagascar Sapphire Padparadscha I have is certified. It's basically some level of guarantee. So, I would say about 10% of the problems are coming out of Sri Lanka, which makes sense. Going back to the Pangea theory. Yeah, just looking at this peach. Again, lighter tone, lower saturation, same stone, but you can see the orange and pink. Yes?
This is kind of an aside, but one thing I've noticed is that with individuals who are wanting to have a pod, the certification, they would prefer GIA, but it seems like AGL goes a little farther in investigating a pod more than GIA. Mm-hmm. So is there anything, I guess, what would your recommendation be if people are looking for a pod and they're staunch on, no, I want GIA?
Yeah.
Although AGL seems to do better, what would you recommend?
My personal preference? So, I'm a big believer in validation. And Chris Smith, who's the owner the president of AGL, my understanding is he verifies every stone himself before it leaves the lab. So I don't know of any other laboratory that would go to that extent, because it's putting the financial side, the finance aside, to verify for their customers' sake personally. And I think that's important. There's a personal touch with every stone he's testing, which is, I think it's credit to him to operate that way. So yeah, I think that I think the accuracy of their grading is also spot on, and we're of the same belief that numerical grading is the most accurate. We don't need to brand name a grade so that it fills a market sector's demand. So, yeah. And this would be another peach, more on the sunrise color. You can see it's more orangish yellow. So, last graph for peach, starting in 2015. I don't know if you guys can see the weight here, but we're starting out at, roughly $25, $30. Oh, yeah, 25 to 30. This is 50 carats. We started out at 15.53 carats, 22 carats, 38 carats, and then there was a big jump between 17 and 18. Does that make sense to everyone? Why? Yeah. So there was a big demand. So then all of a sudden, when we switch over to the next slide, you can see the price shift as well. And so I've capped it off at 193 carats for 2019 of peach. And you can kind of see that the peach color is pretty stable. There's been a slight variation here, 570 per carat. Again, we're looking at 2.93 carat average, ranging from 2 to 4 carats. When I got into that, purchasing peach colors, it was $350. I don't think the jump over 5 years going up to 570 is substantial. So again, I would consider it pretty stable, but it is a color that will come in and go out. That's a given. Padparadschas and blues will be around forever. Peaches and teals, probably not. My prediction, even though there are stability issues with a lab cert, the issues can be eliminated with a fade test. So does that mean stop buying peaches? No. Does it mean don't buy Padparadschas? No. It's the lab is going to guarantee that for you. And I think also when it comes down to Padparadschas, you need a certificate anyway, because very few people can ID that themselves. The color has a lower long-term price volatility versus teal, which is one reason I don't mind, as a business owner, investing in it. Use of numerical grading system will be helpful since peach has a lower tone. This all makes sense. So the last stone we're comparing here is Padparadscha. The color description, again, we use the same description as a peach, but Padparadschas typically will have a higher saturation and a higher tone. So we're using this sunrise and setting sun, or the lotus flower. Origin matters. That with Padparadscha, just like Kashmir, Padparadscha sapphires, just like Burmese pigeon blood, same thing. Padparadscha belongs to traditionalist Sri Lanka. And there is a debate over, should a sapphire of that color be considered a Padparadscha if it's mined outside of Sri Lanka? It'll go back and forth. I think it brings some market stability, but traditionalists, I think as long as you have the correct certification, and it's a reputable lab, the Sri Lankan Padparadschas will always carry their weight. The concern is the pure volume of Madagascar Padparadschas that are hitting the market. Is that going to dilute the Sri Lankan? That's the concern. There are people who are collectors who are spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Sometimes I haven't personally seen a Padparadscha that's hit over 3 million, but we did own one, and I'll show you that at the last slide. But it was 14 karat pod, and it hammered at auction, so it was beautiful. But again, trade terms and the conflict with that and branding. Still, again, we're using that 2080 description to decipher Padparadscha or not Padparadscha, because we don't have multi-million-dollar equipment on the ground in Sri Lanka. Actually, there is no world-class laboratory in Sri Lanka, which is kind of surprising. It has to be, that's why everything has to be sorted twice. I covered Madagascar as a newer source. I haven't seen any Padparadscha type sapphires coming from Tanzania or Kenya, that East African region. I'm sure there's a few here and there, but they just haven't really hit the market. Again, Padparadscha has the stability issue. So just make sure that it gets a Padparadscha cert, but it also is stable. Traditionalists, like I said, believe Padparadscha can only come from Sri Lanka. So moving on. Color description, rising and setting sun, or the lotus flower. So, a quick Google search of a lotus flower will give you the idea of what the setting sun type would look like. Origin impact, it's going to impact price. It just is. And until there's a stronger stance on deciphering, not by brand Padparadscha, because I think that's important, but deciphering between Sri Lanka and Madagascar, or the origins. Otherwise, we're increasing the price of the Madagascar Padparadschas and decreasing the price of the Sri Lankans. And I think that's, to some extent, my personal opinion, to the collectors that have spent, substantial amounts on collecting these, their stuff is going to get devalued. And this is closer to the setting sun. You can kind of see the orange areas here and more pink, more distinctive versus the peach. Can everyone see that? Yeah. And this is also more setting sun. A lot of the Madagascar material is the setting sun. The Western market, meaning the United States and Europe, loves the rising sun. Slight pink, dominant orange. And we'll close with this. This was a 14.07 carat. My partner and I actually mined it in Sri Lanka, and it was unheated. It hammered at auction for $225,000 per carat. And that's the end. Thank you.